Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, September 25th, 2022, and today we are going to be talking about the ABC News Washington Post poll that was just released on the national generic ballot that shows the Republican Party ahead by 5 percentage points amongst likely voters, 1 point amongst registered voters. Now, the reason why this is such a significant poll is because Washington Post is an A-plus rated pollster according to FiveThirtyEight. While they have had some major inaccuracies in the past, in 2018 they were only off by the national generic ballot by about 2 percentage points. So to see them poll this race, to poll our current state of the nation, honestly speaking, it could be correct. It also is news that it completely defies the expectations and the trend of our generic ballot at this point in time. Right now, the Democrats on average are up about 1.3% nationwide, so this Washington Post poll definitely comes in as quite a surprise. Now, it is a surprise in the sense that this is a year where the Democratic Party has certainly turned around the election. However, looking at those numbers from the Washington Post, if this was another type of red wave year, this honestly would be underestimating them. You go back to 2010, you go back to 2014, and you find that the margins of victories were larger than 5 percentage points. And in many cases, the polls actually underestimated the Democratic Party. Now, the Republican Party. Looking at this poll from ABC News, I don't know exactly to what extent that I would trust it when I throw it into the average. I do think that it is a very accurate pollster, and I do think that the A-plus rating cannot go unnoticed. FiveThirtyEight clearly likes this pollster, and for good reason. When you take a look at its electoral history, as I said, in 2018 in specific, they got the House national ballot correct, only off by 3 points and only off by 2 points. They had two different polls that they released when it came down to the generic ballot. On one front, they said that the Democrats were going to win by 7 points. On the other hand, they said the Democrats were going to win by 8 points. The final margin ended up being larger, but at the end of the day, generally got things in the ballpark, but underestimated Democrats. Looking back at 2017, you can see even 2016, when it came down to the national vote between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, they were off by no more than 2 points. In 2017, in the governor's race, they were off by 4 points. In the Senate race, they were off by 1 point. You go to 2020, though, this is where they had some huge inaccuracies, but still some pretty accurate overall gauges on public sentiment. For instance, in the state of Wisconsin, this was the big and most notable failure on behalf of the Washington Post. They said Biden was up 17 points in Wisconsin. He ended up winning by 0.6, a 16.4% difference. It was exceptionally outside the margin of error, but in some other states, they got some things at least correct. They got Michigan correct in terms of its actual winner. It was off by 4 points. Florida was off by 1 point. They said Trump would win Florida. Many other pollsters did not. Pennsylvania, they were off by 6 points, but still accurately predicted that President Biden would win the state. Generally speaking, they've gotten the victors correct, but they were off in North Carolina when it came down to the presidential race and the Senate race. So sometimes they're right, sometimes they're not. Overall, the Washington Post is a generally reliable pollster, but I wouldn't put all of my expectation into it, especially when it defies the average in such a way. I will also point out that ABC News and the Washington Post haven't been too kind to Democrats when it has come down to the generic ballot in the past. When you take a look at their poll from the month of April, you will find that they had the Democrats ahead by 1. Not exactly an overwhelmingly large margin, but also against the odds at that point. You go back previously, you see that in February, they had the Republicans up by 7. So you can continue through and take a look at some of their numbers. In November, they had the Republicans up by 10. So really, it does fluctuate, and in many cases, goes above and below the national expectations for either political party, and in some cases, completely moves against the average. Just something to think about. I will also say that these numbers are a bit misleading on the front, that Real Clear Politics is averaging in the likely voter sample when it comes down to ABC News. I don't know if this is intentional. I'm not trying to call Real Clear Politics out for any of their maneuvering when it comes down to their way that they weight their models, but I will say that it is a bit weird that they use the likely vote sample for the generic congressional vote value when in all of the other polls they did not. In April, they used registered voters. In February, they used registered voters. When you take a look back in November, they used registered voters. So they had the ability, at least so it seems, to do the same thing this time around and utilize the registered voters, which were Republicans +1, but they opted for the likely voters. I think they opted for the likely voters because it gave the Republican Party a more advantageous lead. Real Clear Politics, at least when it comes down to what they publish on their website and the way that they have been skewing, it seems very much that it is geared towards the right wing. But I will say that I do like a lot of their data and the way that they aggregate their data, so I'm not going to go ahead and nitpick too hard into this, but I will say that if they were following their standard from all of the other ABC News polls, this would be Republican +1 and not Republican +5, because quite frankly, in a high turnout midterm year like this one is expected to be, likely voters really don't matter because it doesn't gauge for that. Nobody has a turnout model and nobody knows what the expected turnout is going to look like, except for few and far between pollsters and pundits, ones that say it's going to match 2018, others that say it's going to go over 2018, some others saying it's going under 2018. So generally speaking, I would say that I would have preferred them opt to use the standard type of metric that they did in the past. But at the end of the day, the likely voter number is still there. But the top line is Republican +1, not Republican +5, just for additional context. But even when that is thrown into consideration, you actually find that the Democrats are maintaining a lead of about 1.3% on 538, but it has narrowed down somewhat significantly on the ballot on Real Clear Politics, because the Democrats actually maintained a 2-point lead on Real Clear Politics for a brief period of time. It seems here that it was actually only 1.3%, but I do remember a 2-point lead for the Democrats. I think I have a video of it up. Maybe it was on 538. But looking at this decrease to go from 1.3 down to 0.3, well, it starts to show how the impact of this poll in particular has had on the overall numbers. Looking at the 538 generic ballot, it also seems to have had a negative impact on the Democratic Party, but quite frankly, as it should. But to the extent that it did on Real Clear Politics, again, maybe that's why they opted for the Republican +5 lead, because it would have caused more of a shift on the overall generic ballot. Now, looking at President Biden's approval rating, another thing that really jumps out from this poll is the overwhelming disapproval of President Biden. When you take a look at their most recent poll, you will find that just 39% of Americans, according to ABC News, approve of the job that Joe Biden is doing. 53% disapprove. When you take a look at the overall numbers, though, the average here is 43 for approve and 53 for disapprove. Looking at the adjusted model for ABC News, you will find that 40% approve, 53% disapprove, but it's not too much off from what the actual numbers said. But it is off from the average. 53 makes sense, 43 being the average, but only 40 being on the actual doesn't really make that much sense. I think there is something exceptionally different about the ABC News poll. I'm interested to see if it's more accurate or more inaccurate when it comes down to the overall outcome of the election this time around. I think what we have seen thus far from ABC News is that it does seem to skew away from the average, whether in favor of Democrats or Republicans, and we are finding that to be true this time around as well. So it will be quite an interesting race to watch. I will also say that the impact that this has had on the overall forecast hasn't been too heavy. The Democrats have been reduced from a 31% chance of victory in the House down to 30%. It's nothing super significant, but it is a little bit interesting to point out. The Republicans now have a 70% chance at the House and a 31% chance at the Senate, meaning that now the Republicans have a higher chance in the Senate than Democrats do in the House. It was the opposite just a few days ago. So you can start to see how some of these polls slightly nudge these models in a way that becomes more favorable for the GOP rather than more favorable for the Democratic Party, especially when the numbers are not so much lopsided in the favor of the Democratic Party as many of these other polls would tell you. For instance, the Economist YouGov poll, Democrats +5, Politico Morning Consult, Democrats +5, Emerson College, tie, that was Republican before, NBC News, tie, was Republican before, Fox News, Democrats +3, was Republican before, New York Times Siena College, Democrats +2, Harvard Harris, Democrats +2, Trafalgar showing an improvement for the GOP, but overall, I would say, what I get from this is that there are some outliers here, but it's about 4 of them. 4 of them show the GOP ahead, and Trafalgar is a Republican pollster. It has, very well known as a Republican internal pollster, might I add, and very much different from the rest of the way that they do methodology, the way that they do analysis, whatever it might be. But looking at ABC News, looking at CBS News, and looking at Rasmussen reports, well, these also come together and say the GOP is ahead, and none larger than ABC News, besides Trafalgar, but again, we've already addressed their biases. So ABC News, I think, really just is this shocking poll because it has come out against the average in a way that is quite unexpected. There are many Republicans out there that don't trust the polls, though, that are using this as a point to say that Republicans are ahead. You cannot say you don't trust the polls when it shows the Democrats ahead and then completely flaunt this one. I do think that this one should be thrown into the average, and I do think there is validity behind the ABC News poll. I don't think we should throw it out. I don't think we should not consider it because it doesn't match the average. At the end of the day, polls are to find what they might find, and honestly, there is a real possibility that ABC News is picking up a trend that hasn't been picked up on before. But I will say that might not always be the case. There also seems to be a difference here when it comes down to likely voters and registered voters. Every single likely voters poll that we've seen here is either a tie or has the Republicans ahead. Every single registered voters poll has the Democrats ahead, and one of them has a tie. So you start to see where the difference is here. Historically speaking, likely voter polls overestimate the GOP simply because of the fact that they poll a more white audience, which thus means more conservative, and older audience because it's based off of who votes the most. Who votes the most? White Americans. Who votes the most? Older Americans. Who votes the most? Educated Americans. So generally speaking, when I say educated, I mean it in the sense college degree, doctorate degree, even, high school diploma. When you look at the amount of people who vote by each education level, race, income, age, you always find that as you get to older, wealthier, more educated, and also just in general, white Americans, they are the most likely to vote. And it just so happens that they are the most conservative group in this entire country. There are pitfalls, though, of using a likely voter metric. Back in 2018, some of these likely voter polls got things correct, and a lot of them transitioned to the time we reached the election. But Rasmussen reports, one of the pollsters that's showing the Republican ahead by 2 right now, showing Republicans ahead by 1 back in 2018. They ended up being off by over 9 points. So there are inaccuracies that certainly can be seen and can be calculated through the fact that likely voter was prioritized over registered voters, but as we get closer to election day, you might start to see that change. However, knowing the 2018 turnout, some of these pollsters are going to go into this apprehensive because they don't know what the composition is going to look like this November. They don't know who is going to be the most inspired to turn out, the least inspired to turn out. They don't know what the racial, socioeconomic, whatever it might be, backgrounds are of the voters this November, and quite frankly, nobody does. So it's a very difficult race to poll, and ABC News is telling us different from what the rest of the pollsters have been telling us, but then again, we do need to recognize that. I also think that the political betting markets are having a reaction to some of the polls that we have seen thus far. I think with the Republican Party, yes, decreasing in chances of the House, certainly decreasing in terms of their chance of the Senate, but I will say this is quite interesting. Democrats go from 30 cents all the way up to 60 cents now. I will say, though, there seems to be a plateauing or a decrease in some cases for the Democratic Party as more people become hesitant to believe the Democrats might actually take it away with this race. And they honestly can't be blamed. Democrats are in a position about 43 days out till the election where they are in a good one when it comes down to the Senate, but not so much in the House. The House has been treated as this foregone conclusion, and it probably can still be treated as such. The GOP is still more than likely going to win control of the House of Representatives, but it was never in a question that Democrats could even come close previously, and now they might. They may not win it, they may lose it, but they may only lose it by 10 seats. And honestly, that would be a safe bet for the Democratic Party, because quite frankly, the GOP can't agree on as much as the Democratic Party can do, because Kevin McCarthy is no Nancy Pelosi when it comes down to whipping votes. I will also say that people are apprehensive largely because these numbers are fluctuating. When you are someone who is spending money on a betting market and you see all of a sudden that an A+ rated pollster is showing the GOP ahead by 5, you start to question yourself. You start to think, am I off? Am I going to be the one who's inaccurately predicting these midterm elections? And in a sense, you don't want to be wrong because you have your money behind the race. I'm just running this in the background so you can watch something on the screen while I'm talking to you about this. But, generally speaking, people don't want to be wrong about these things, especially when they put money behind their statements. I think at this point in time, what we are going to find is that the Democratic Party is in a pretty good position when it comes down to our Senate elections, but the House doesn't seem too good. The generic ballot is a good indicator, but it's a lagging one at that. And even if Republicans are leading by 5 points on the ABC News poll, there's no guarantee that it means they're actually leading by 5 points as of right now. And again, I've already aired out my grievances with changing all of a sudden to likely voters instead of registered voters on the average to skew the numbers. I think the GOP still has an inherent lead when it comes down to the House because of redistricting and many other things. I also think this year is going to be closer than 2020 was and 2018 was as well. At best for Democrats, it's going to be a mediocre year for them. But that isn't too difficult to see why that's good news, because the Senate only needs a mediocre year for Democrats to hold on to it, considering their advantages in Pennsylvania, Arizona, etc. But when it comes down to the House, this is where Democrats really want to maintain control, but honestly, things needed to get a lot better a lot quicker. And this ABC News is putting a runt in that. It's stopping the Democrats down the road by saying, hey, you're losing by a pretty significant amount nationwide, and thus the Democrats are not super confident, I don't think, going into these midterms as they were before the ABC News poll was released. It's also a poll of reputation. It's a poll that people trust and people utilize all the time, and I think that also really plays a major role in the understanding of our midterm elections, the confidence that goes into it, and overall the sentiment for either political party. But then again, it could be an outlier. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.